Clara Holt knew the weight of every egg. She knew it in the muscles of her arms as she carried the wide, shallow crate from the henhouse, and she knew it as a pressure in her chest, a calculation of debt and flour and medicine for her mother. For 2 years, since her father's lungs had filled with dust and quieted for good, the hens had been the only thing standing between their small farm and the bank in Crestfall. The farm itself, 73 acres of mostly rock and stubborn Wyoming grass, was barely worth the paper the loan was written on. But it was home. So every morning, before the sun had burned the chill from the air, she hitched their old gelding, Jed, to the cart and began her route. October had brought a sharp, biting wind that promised a hard winter. It snapped at the canvas cover over her eggs and found the thin spots in her father's old coat. Her route was a fixed thing, a line drawn through the valley connecting the few households with enough cash to spare for fresh eggs. The last stop was always the furthest, the old Aldred place at the mouth of the canyon, which had sat empty for as long as she could remember. But 6 weeks ago, smoke had started rising from its stone chimney. A man had come. She'd learned his name from Mr. Harris at the general store. James Rudd. A quiet man, Harris had said, who bought nails and lumber and flour in bulk and paid in cash. He didn't talk much, just nodded and loaded his wagon. He was, the town supposed, a cousin or some other relation to the Aldreds who had vanished so abruptly years back. Now, on this Tuesday morning, Clara pulled Jed to a halt before the house. It looked different. The sagging porch had been leveled, the broken windows replaced. New shingles dotted the roof like fresh stitches on an old wound. It was the house of a man who intended to stay. She took a breath, gathered the crate, and walked to the door. It was solid oak, and her knock sounded small against it. She waited, the cold seeping into her boots. She could hear movement inside, then the slide of a bolt. The door swung inward. He was taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders that filled the frame. His hair was the color of dark, wet earth, and his eyes were a steady, quiet gray. He had a dusting of flour on his hands and along the sleeve of his blue work shirt. He looked from her face to the crate of pale brown eggs nestled in straw. The air that drifted out from the house was a miracle. It smelled of coffee and baking bread and the clean scent of burning pine. "You must be Clara Holt," he said. His voice was low and even, like stones settling in a riverbed. "I am," she managed. "I sell eggs. If you have a need." He looked at the crate again, then back at her. A small, slow smile touched the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a grin, but something quieter, an acknowledgement. "I do. I'll take 6 dozen. Clara blinked. 6 dozen. That was more than half her stock. It was enough to buy the liniment her mother needed and a bag of oats for Jed. 6 dozen? She repeated, to be sure. "If you'll share breakfast," he said, and it wasn't a question. He stepped back, holding the door wider. "Coffee's on. Bread's just out of the oven." She hesitated for only a second. The warmth from the kitchen pulled at her, a current in the cold air. She had never been invited into a customer's home. It wasn't how things were done. But the smell of the coffee was a powerful argument, and the look in his eyes was direct and not unkindly. "All right," she said, and stepped over the threshold. The kitchen was the heart of the house. It was spare but clean, with a long plank table and a huge stone hearth where a fire crackled. A pot of coffee sat on the trivet, and 2 thick mugs were already on the table. He had poured the coffee before he'd even opened the door. The thought registered with a strange little jolt. He had been expecting her. He took the crate from her and set it carefully on a side bench. "Have a seat. It's warm by the fire." She did as he said, pulling off her worn gloves and holding her hands out to the blaze. The heat was a living thing, sinking deep into her bones. James Rudd moved around the kitchen with a quiet efficiency, slicing a thick loaf of bread and setting out a crock of butter and a jar of apple preserves. He brought the plates to the table and sat opposite her, pushing a steaming mug across the wood. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. He just nodded, buttering a slice of bread. They ate in silence for a few moments, a quiet filled only by the crackle of the fire and the scrape of knives. The bread was better than it had any right to be, with a crisp crust and a soft, yielding center. It was the bread of a man who paid attention to his work. "You've done a lot with the place," she said, breaking the quiet. "It needed it," he answered, not looking up from his plate. "A house needs tending. Same as anything else." He took a sip of coffee. "You run your father's farm alone now, Harris tells me. For 2 years. My mother, she's not well. That's a heavy load." It was a simple statement of fact. Not pity, just observation. She found it easier to answer than the worried clucking of the women in town. "The hens do most of the work. I just carry the eggs." He looked at her then, a direct and measuring gaze. "I expect there's more to it than that." She felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He saw. He didn't flatter or fuss, but he saw the truth of it. He asked more questions after that. He asked about the soil in the valley, about the water levels in the creek, about which fences held against the winter snows and which ones always failed. He asked about the people, who was reliable, who kept to themselves. He asked like a man learning a map, feeling out its edges and contours before deciding where to build his own house. She answered plainly, finding a strange relief in talking about things that were solid and real. She told him about the blight that had taken the apple trees 5 years back, and the way the spring floods of '86 had changed the course of Teller's Creek. She stayed for an hour. When she finally stood to leave, the sun was high and the kitchen was filled with a soft, warm light. He packed the empty egg trays back into her crate. "Same time next Tuesday?" he asked, his hand on the door. "I'll be here," she said. As she guided Jed back down the lane, the cart felt lighter, and not just because of the missing eggs. The pressure in her chest had eased, just a fraction. For the first time in 2 years, a piece of her day had not been about calculation and worry. It had just been warm. The Tuesday breakfasts became a ritual, a single solid point in the turning wheel of her week. Every Tuesday, she would knock, and the door would open to the smell of coffee and fresh bread. Every Tuesday, he would have 2 mugs already on the table. He never asked if she was staying. It was simply understood. He always bought 6 dozen eggs. Their conversations remained practical, rooted in the earth beneath their feet. They talked about the price of feed, the best way to mend a harness, the signs of an early frost. Through these small, mundane topics, she learned him. She learned he was from the eastern side of the mountains, that he had worked as a carpenter, that he preferred his coffee black and strong. She learned the way he would go quiet and still when he was thinking, his gray eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the kitchen window. He learned her, too. He learned she was saving for a new coop, that her mother had good days and bad, that she had a quiet, dry wit that appeared when she was comfortable. One Tuesday, she arrived to find a tear in the sleeve of his work shirt, near the elbow. A long, jagged rip from catching on a nail, most likely. He didn't seem to notice it. She said nothing, but the image of it stayed with her. The following Monday evening, sitting by the fire with her mother sleeping in the next room, she took out her sewing basket. She found a patch of sturdy blue cloth that was almost a perfect match. The next morning, when he took the crate from her, she held out the small, neatly folded patch. "For your shirt," she said, her eyes on the floor. "I noticed it was torn." He took it from her, his calloused fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt all the way up her arm. He looked at the patch, then at her. He didn't say thank you. He just nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, and his eyes held a new light in them. It was a look of quiet understanding that felt more profound than any words of gratitude. That day, there was a small bowl of late-season raspberries on the table, picked from a thorny patch he must have found high up on the ridge. A trade, an unspoken acknowledgement. As the weeks wore on, the silences between them grew longer, more comfortable. There were no longer empty spaces to be filled, but a shared quiet, a rest. She would watch him as he stared into the fire, his face all angles and shadows, and wonder about the man he was before he came to Crestfall. He carried a stillness about him, a settled weight, but there was a sorrow in it too, a history he did not speak of. The shift in perspective to James happened slowly, like the turning of a season. After she left each Tuesday, the kitchen felt cavernous and cold. The silence was no longer peaceful but empty. He would stand at the window and watch her little cart trundle down the lane until it was just a speck. He had come to this valley to rebuild his brother's house, to reclaim a piece of his family's dignity from the dust. It was meant to be a solitary act of atonement and labor. He hadn't accounted for Clara Holt. He found himself thinking of her at odd times. When he was setting a new post for the fence, he'd remember the determined set of her jaw and think, "That's a woman who knows how to build a straight fence." When he was kneading bread, he would remember the rare, quick smile that would light up her face, and his hands would slow in their work. The day felt properly started only after she had been there, her presence a quiet warmth that lingered long after she was gone. He started looking forward to Tuesdays with an intensity that surprised him. It was a foolish thing, this feeling, a complication he had not planned for. But it was there, solid and undeniable, like the stone foundation of the house. The first snow fell in late November, a light dusting that outlined every branch and fence post in white. Clara arrived that Tuesday with her cheeks pink from the cold, a woolen scarf wrapped high around her neck. The kitchen was warmer than ever, the fire roaring. "Bank sent a letter," she said, after their first cup of coffee. Her voice was flat. She stared into her mug as she spoke. "Mr. Croft is concerned about the outstanding balance. He suggests that if I cannot make a larger payment by spring, they will have to begin foreclosure proceedings." James went very still. He set his mug down on the table with a soft, definitive click. Silas Croft. It wasn't a question. The name hung in the air between them, cold and heavy. "You know him," Clara stated, looking up at him. His face was a mask, his gray eyes gone hard as flint. "This was my brother's place," James said, his voice low and tight. "William Aldred. 3 years ago he had a small herd of cattle. Croft, who held the note on this land then, too, accused him of rustling. Said some of his cattle had been rebranded. There was no proof, no trial. Just whispers and accusations, all started by Croft and his men. No one in the valley would buy from William after that. No one would trade with him. Croft squeezed him until he had no choice but to sell the land to the bank for a fraction of its worth and leave the state in shame. He fell silent, his hands clenched into fists on the table. The story settled into the room, explaining the sorrow she had sensed in him, the quiet, fierce determination of his work. He wasn't just rebuilding a house. He was rebuilding a life that had been stolen. "The debt my father took out," Clara began, understanding dawning. "It was from Croft's bank. Right after your brother left. He preys on people when they're down," James said, his voice rough. "A death in the family, a bad harvest. That's his time." Suddenly, it wasn't just her debt. It was their shared history, a common wound. The same man who had driven his brother from this land was now threatening to drive her from hers. The quiet breakfasts, the unspoken gestures, the comfortable silences, they had all been leading to this. A shared enemy, a shared fight. She looked at him, at the rigid line of his jaw and the anger burning in his eyes. It was an anger on her behalf, she realized, as much as for his brother. In that moment, the small, warm space of the kitchen felt like a fortress against the cold world outside. "What do we do?" she asked, and the "we" was the most natural thing she had ever said. He unclenched his fists and met her gaze. The fire was still in his eyes, but it was tempered now with resolve. "We don't let him win," he said. "Not again." The weeks that followed were different. The breakfasts continued, but the conversation was now one of strategy. James had some savings, enough to make a difference. They pored over her father's old ledgers and the bank notices, their heads close together over the long plank table. He had a sharp mind for numbers and a clearer understanding of the legal language Croft used to intimidate. He found discrepancies, small points of leverage. Hope, which had been a dangerous and fragile thing for Clara, began to feel solid, tangible. But the valley was watching. News traveled on the wind in a place like Crestfall. The sight of Clara's cart at the old Aldred place every Tuesday had been noted. Now, with the snows deepening, the fact that James Rudd was seen riding into town with her, sitting beside her on the cart's narrow bench, was the subject of quiet speculation at the general store and the saloon, and it was noticed by Henry Bishop. Henry was the son of the wealthiest rancher in the county. He was handsome, well-regarded, and had always been polite to Clara, but he had never shown any particular interest. Until now. One afternoon, as she was leaving the general store, he tipped his hat to her, his smile confident. "Miss Holt," he said, "I was sorry to hear of the bank's pressure. My father and we hold Silas Croft in no high regard. If you would permit it, I would be honored to settle that debt for you." As a neighborly gesture. Clara was taken aback. It was a generous offer, but it was not merely neighborly. It was the opening move of a courtship, a declaration of intent for the whole town to see. A man like Henry Bishop did not offer to pay a woman's debts without expecting something in return. A wife. A merger of properties. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Bishop," she said carefully. "But it's a family matter. I intend to handle it myself." "Of course," he said, his smile not faltering. "But my offer stands. A woman shouldn't have to carry such a burden alone." He tipped his hat again and walked away, leaving Clara standing in the muddy street with a new and complicated worry. The news of Henry Bishop's offer reached James before the end of the day. Mr. Harris, the store owner, delivered it himself when James came in for lamp oil. Harris was a decent man who saw more than he let on. "Young Bishop made quite the public offer to Clara Holt this afternoon," Harris said, wiping down the counter with a cloth. "Wants to pay off her debt to Croft. A good match, some would say. He's got land and prospects." He paused, looking directly at James. "Though I reckon some others are moving a bit slow on the matter. A man can spend so much time rebuilding a house, he forgets to see who ought to be living in it with him." The words struck James with the force of a physical blow. He paid for his oil, nodded curtly to Harris, and left the store. He walked his horse back to the farm in a daze. Slow. Harris was right. He had been slow. He had been so focused on the practicalities, the debt, the numbers, the injustice of it all, that he had failed to see the larger truth standing right in front of him. He had been hiding in the work, in the shared problem, because it was easier than confronting the feeling that had been growing in him since the first time she had knocked on his door. The thought of Clara accepting Bishop's offer, of her sitting at another man's table, of another man seeing that rare, quick smile, it was like a fist closing around his heart. Bishop wasn't a villain. He was a respectable man offering a respectable solution. He was offering Clara a safety she deserved. What was James offering? Tuesday breakfasts and a shared fight that they might not even win. He didn't sleep that night. He paced the cold floors of the house he had so painstakingly rebuilt. He looked at the empty chair where she sat every week. It wasn't just a house. He hadn't just been rebuilding it for his brother's memory. He had been building it for her. He had known it, somewhere deep down, from the moment he first poured 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. He had to speak. No, not next Tuesday. Not after they dealt with Croft. Now, before he lost the chance forever. He didn't wait for the sun. In the gray pre-dawn light, he pulled on his coat and walked across the frosted fields that separated their properties. The air was achingly cold and still. A thin ribbon of smoke was already rising from her chimney. She was awake. Of course she was. Her days started before anyone else's. He found her on the back porch, wrapped in a thick shawl, her hands busy mending a strap of harness leather. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary, surprised. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his breath pluming in the cold air. He didn't know where to begin. All the words he had rehearsed on his walkover seemed foolish and thin. "Clara," he started, his voice rougher than he intended. She waited, her hands stilling in her lap. "I heard about Henry Bishop's offer," he said. She nodded slowly. "It was kind of him." "It was," James agreed. "He's a good man. He can offer you a lot. A life without debt. Security." He took a breath. "Mr. Harris told me I was being slow. He was right. I've been slow about this." He looked at her strong, capable hands and her steady, patient eyes. He had to say it plainly. It was the only way he knew. "When I came here, I just meant to fix the house, to make right what was done to my brother. It was just work. And then you came to the door with your eggs." He gestured vaguely toward his own house, dark against the lightening sky. "That first morning, I poured 2 cups of coffee before I knew if you'd even speak to me. I think I knew then. I've just been too slow to say it." He took a step closer, his gaze locked on hers. "I don't want to just help you with the debt, Clara. That's not it. Not anymore. I want to build a life with you. Here, in that house. I want to have breakfast with you every morning, not just on Tuesdays. I love you. I would like to stay as your husband." The words hung in the silent air between them. They were plain, unadorned, but they held the weight of every unspoken thought, every shared silence, every cup of coffee he had ever poured for her. She looked down at the mending in her lap, then back up at him. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, the one he had come to prize above all else. It was full of warmth and relief and a gentle, wry humor. "James Rudd," she said softly. "It took you long enough." He felt the tension drain out of him in a single, shuddering breath. He walked up the steps and stood before her. She rose from her chair, letting the piece of harness fall to the floor. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and sure. "Obviously, yes." Their courtship was as practical and steady as they were. James went with her to the bank. Armed with his savings and the discrepancies he had found in the loan documents, they faced Silas Croft not as 2 separate, struggling individuals, but as a unit. Croft, faced with a determined man who knew the law and had the funds to back up his claims, and who clearly knew the story of William Aldred, relented. The debt was restructured, the interest lowered to a manageable rate. The threat of foreclosure vanished. It was a victory, quiet but profound. They worked side by side through the rest of the winter. He helped her build the new, larger henhouse she had dreamed of, his skill with a hammer and saw making the work go twice as fast. She brought order and warmth to his spare, masculine house, hanging curtains she had sewn and planting a small herb garden by the kitchen door as soon as the ground thawed. They ate their meals together every day, the long plank table no longer a place for temporary meetings, but the center of their shared life. They talked about real things, about the future, about what they would name their first child, about which fields to plant with corn and which to leave for grazing. They were married in the spring, on a bright, clear day in May. The ceremony was held on the newly repaired porch of James's house, the one he had rebuilt with his own hands. The whole of Crestfall seemed to be there. Mr. Harris stood beside James, and Clara's mother, Eleanor, sat in a chair in the front row, a fragile but genuine smile on her face. Clara wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, the color of a spring sky. She had made it herself. When the circuit preacher pronounced them man and wife, James didn't kiss her with a flourish. He simply took her hand in his grip firm and sure, and looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. The town saw it. They saw the rightness of it, the solid, settled truth of their union. 5 years later, the evening sun cast long, golden shadows across the valley. The two properties, hers and his, were now one thriving farm. The fence between them was long gone. James sat on the porch swing, slowly pushing it back and forth with one boot. Clara sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, a mending basket in her lap. The sound of children's laughter drifted up from the yard below, where 4-year-old William, a quiet, serious boy with his father's gray eyes, was patiently showing his 2-year-old sister, Annie, how to stack blocks. Annie, who had her mother's determined spirit, kept knocking them down with a delighted shriek. "She has your patience," Clara said dryly. James grunted, a sound of amusement. "She has your stubbornness." He reached over and stilled her hands, taking the needle from her fingers. "Enough work for one day." She let out a soft sigh and leaned more heavily against him. The air was cool and smelled of cut grass and damp earth. It was a good smell, the smell of their life. He was quiet for a long time, watching their children play as the light faded. "Do you ever think about that first morning?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "The one where you tried to buy my entire inventory of eggs?" she asked, a smile in her voice. "Sometimes. I thought you were either crazy or the hungriest man in Wyoming. I was just trying to figure out a way to make you stay for a cup of coffee," he admitted. "You already had it poured," she reminded him. "That told me everything I needed to know." He turned his head and kissed the top of hers. "Good," he said. "Saved me a lot of talking." She laughed, a soft, happy sound. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the deepening twilight. The house behind them was warm and filled with the smell of the stew she had made for supper. The children's laughter subsided into contented murmurs. It was all solid. It was all real. Everything he had hoped for, everything she had fought for, was right here, in this shared quiet on a summer evening. That is the way of things, sometimes. A life isn't always built on grand declarations or dramatic events. More often, it is built quietly, steadily, one small gesture at a time. It is built on the unspoken promise of a cup of coffee poured before a knock ever comes, on a patch of cloth offered for a torn sleeve, on the shared understanding that a burden is lighter when it is carried by two. Love, the lasting kind, is often a practical matter, a slow and steady construction, like a well-built house that is made to stand against the winter winds. It finds its voice not in poetry, but in the simple, profound language of showing up day after day.